Prince Edward thought he had already made peace with a lifetime of quiet duty. But one confirmed promise changed everything. When royal historians finally authenticated a private pledge made by the Queen decades earlier, the room fell into a silence no one could soften. Edward did not speak at first. He simply lowered his eyes, gripped the edge of the table, and realized the mother he mourned had remembered him all along. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Edward felt the words strike deeper than any public honor ever had. The historians had not arrived with gossip or palace whispers. They had arrived with a documented account from the Royal Archive, a protected collection where private letters, memorandums, and family papers are stored for historical review. In that closed Windsor room, they confirmed that the monarch had made a direct promise decades earlier, naming her youngest son as the rightful guardian of Prince Philip's Edinburgh legacy, and the sealed Windsor service papers. Those papers mattered because they held the record of Philip's charitable mission, private correspondence, and personal wishes for how his life's work should be protected after his death. Edward understood immediately that this was not decoration, this was trust. Sophie watched Edward's face change before anyone else dared to react. She had seen him carry disappointment with discipline, seen him smile through ceremonies where his loyalty was treated as background noise, seen him stand beside Philip without trying to claim attention. Now the trusted confidant saw something different. His hand tightened against the table, then slowly loosened, as if the confirmation had broken through a wall he had spent years building. Sophie moved her hand near his, close enough to steady him, but not close enough to steal the moment. Edward needed to hear it alone. He needed to feel the full weight of the Queen's choice. The lead historian then read the most painful line aloud. The pledge was not ceremonial language, meaning it was not a polite royal phrase written for tradition or public display. It was a private instruction, written with intent, stating that Edward's patience, loyalty, and restraint would one day be formally acknowledged. The room changed. Charles sat motionless, as the king absorbed what his mother had preserved outside ordinary palace channels. William looked toward Edward with controlled shock, while the prince understood that this confirmation could reshape the family's understanding of quiet duty. Anne said nothing, but her eyes fixed on the handwriting as if she recognized the monarch's will immediately. Then came the sealed notation beside the Queen's words. Someone had marked the promise to remain withheld until the proper moment, and that single detail turned emotion into suspense. Charles knew the question would follow. William knew it too. Anne's silence sharpened. Sophie looked again at Edward, and Edward finally raised his eyes. His grief had become something heavier than sorrow. It had become proof. But before Edward could understand what the promise meant for his future, the palace had to face the people whose lives were now bound to it. Edward had never been the loudest figure in the royal family, and that was exactly why the Queen's promise struck so deeply. While others carried headlines, crowns, scandals, and battles for influence, he carried something quieter: endurance. The confirmation did not simply honor him. It exposed years of overlooked loyalty, private sacrifice, and a mother's careful decision to protect the one child who never demanded recognition. Edward remained seated long after the historians had left, as if moving too quickly might break the fragile truth they had placed before him. Sophie stayed beside him, close enough to understand the silence, wise enough not to rush it. For years, he had stood at the edge of royal storms, while louder names filled the room. He had attended the ceremonies, carried the duties, accepted the smiles, and swallowed the moments when his service vanished beneath other people's drama. Yet now, with the Queen's promise confirmed, those quiet years no longer felt invisible. They felt recorded, they felt witnessed, and that was what hurt most. Sophie knew exactly why the moment mattered. She had watched Edward give himself to duty without turning it into performance. She had seen him step forward when needed, then step back, before anyone could accuse him of seeking attention. His work had often been overshadowed by public battles surrounding Charles, William, Anne, and others who carried heavier headlines. But Sophie understood that the monarchy did not survive on headline alone. It survived on people who stayed when applause disappeared. That was the wound Edward carried, and now the Queen's words had touched it directly. Edward finally spoke, but his voice barely rose above a whisper. He told Sophie that hearing the promise felt like receiving a conversation his mother never had time to finish. The Queen had always been measured, careful, and guarded with emotion, and he had learned not to ask for more than she gave. But this promise felt different. It felt like a hand reaching back through the years, proving that she had seen his patience, even when she did not praise it openly. Sophie looked at him with quiet pain, because she knew the gift had arrived wrapped in grief. Charles felt the pressure almost immediately. He did not reject Edward's place, but the confirmation reopened a painful question. After the Queen's death, had the family moved too quickly past what she privately intended? The king understood that this was not simply about affection between mother and son. It was about authority, memory, and the dangerous gap between public decisions and private promises. If Edward had been chosen for something sacred, then every choice made afterward would now be measured against that hidden standard. Anne studied the memorandum with the sharp stillness of someone recognizing a voice from beyond the grave. She knew the Queen's tone. She knew when her mother was being formal, and when she was being final. This was not gentle encouragement. This carried emotional command. William sensed it too. The prince understood that the confirmation could reshape how the family spoke about service, inheritance, and loyalty in the post-Elizabeth era. It forced them to ask whether quiet devotion had been undervalued for too long. And as Edward sat there, shaken but no longer unseen, the private meaning of the promise began to pull the family backward. Because such words did not appear by accident. Something had caused the Queen to make that pledge. Something specific, something remembered. And the deeper the family looked into the Queen's words, the more one forgotten incident began to rise from the past. Every royal promise has a beginning, and this one began in a moment almost no one outside the family ever understood. It was not born from ceremony, politics, or public applause. It began after a private dinner at Balmoral, when the Queen watched Edward defend Philip's work with a quiet force that stunned the room. By morning, she had made a decision that would echo for decades. Edward had carried that night in fragments, never knowing it had become the root of something larger. The Balmoral Library dinner of August 2001 had seemed, at first, like another private royal discussion, hidden behind old walls and careful voices. Balmoral, the Scottish residence where the royal family often retreated from public life, became the place where a quiet disagreement turned into a defining act of loyalty. Senior aides wanted Philip's Edinburgh legacy folded into a broader palace committee, a formal group that would manage duties, papers, and public projects under one shared structure. To them, it sounded efficient. To Edward, it sounded like erasure. Philip remained almost silent, while the discussion tightened around the table. That silence mattered, because his life's work was not just a title or a ceremonial badge. The Edinburgh legacy carried decades of service, youth development, charitable discipline, and a belief that duty should build character, not headlines. Edward understood that better than anyone in the room, and the Queen saw it before he even finished speaking. He did not raise his voice to overpower the aides. He did not turn the moment into rebellion. He simply refused to let his father's work become another file passed between people who did not understand its soul. Edward's voice trembled when he finally challenged them, but it did not break. He said Philip's legacy had to be protected by someone who understood service without vanity. Those words cut through the room because they were not polished for effect. They came from years of watching his father give meaning to duty, while others measured royal importance through rank. The Queen looked at her youngest son with a stillness that carried more emotion than praise ever could. She heard not ambition, but devotion. She heard not demand, but guardianship, and in that instant, she understood that Edward was not asking to inherit attention. He was asking to protect meaning. Philip waited until later before speaking. When the queen stood apart from the others, carrying the weight of what she had heard, he gave her the quiet confirmation that sealed the night. He understands. Those two words became the hidden hinge of the entire story. That same night, the queen wrote a private memorandum, a personal instruction preserved outside ordinary conversation, promising that Edward would one day guard the Edinburgh legacy and the sealed Windsor service papers. The sealed papers were protected family and service records, kept from routine access because they carried private wishes, correspondence, and sensitive royal decisions. A historian later identified a second notation in Philip's hand, confirming that he knew about the promise and accepted it without alteration. That detail changed everything. Edward's tears were no longer only about a mother's memory, they were about both parents recognizing him in a room where history had once nearly moved against him. But recognition also created danger, because others had acted for years as if the matter had already been settled. Once that Balmoral night returned to the center of the story, silence was no longer possible inside the palace. The confrontation did not begin with shouting. It began with a chair scraping softly across the floor, and Charles lowering himself into it, as though the weight of the past had finally entered the room. Edward stood across from him, not angry, not triumphant, but wounded. Between them sat the confirmed promise, and for the first time, brother faced brother with the Queen's words impossible to ignore. Charles knew the room had changed before anyone spoke. Windsor had held countless private family meetings, but this one carried a different kind of pressure because it was no longer about rumor, preference, or palace management. It was about a confirmed promise left by their mother, and every person present understood that such words could not be treated like a passing note. Edward stood with Sophie close beside him, while Anne remained still, and William watched the exchange with the careful restraint of a man measuring the future. The memorandum, a written record of the Queen's private instruction, had turned grief into evidence. Edward spoke first, and the room tightened around him. He told Charles that he had never asked for recognition, never demanded a louder place, never tried to turn Philip's legacy into personal victory. But he could not pretend the Queen's promise meant nothing now that historians had authenticated it. Edward's pain did not come from ambition. It came from the years of accepting silence, only to discover that his mother had quietly marked his loyalty, while others moved forward, as though that loyalty needed no reward. Sophie heard the break in his voice, and stayed beside him, steady and protective, because she knew this moment was not. It was about a son finally being seen. Charles removed his glasses and set them beside the memorandum. The gesture said what he could not yet admit fully. Hearing their mother's words in that form felt like being judged by history, and the king knew it. He did not reject Edward. That was what made the moment more painful. Charles understood that honoring the promise might also expose how much had been decided after the Queen's death, without the full force of her private wishes in view. He looked at Edward, then at the file, and the silence between the brothers became heavier than accusation. Anne broke that silence with a sharpness no one mistook for cruelty. She said the Queen's private decisions were rarely accidental, and when the monarch wrote with that level of care, the family had no right to soften it into sentiment. Anne knew her mother's tone. She knew the difference between affection and command. William then asked the question everyone had feared: had palace records been altered, delayed, or separated to keep the promise from becoming known? The prince did not raise his voice, but his words carried through the room like a warning. Charles closed the folder slowly, and the sound seemed to settle over everyone. Edward did not move. Sophie did not look away. Anne's expression hardened, while William understood that the family had crossed into dangerous ground. The confrontation had ended without shouting, but the quiet left behind was worse. It suggested that emotion was only the surface, and beneath it lay a trail of decisions someone would now have to explain. And behind the emotion stood the harder question: who had the authority to decide what the Queen's promise would become? Promises inside the monarchy do not survive on emotion alone. They pass through hands, offices, archives, signatures, and people who know exactly how long silence can protect power. As Edward waited for clarity, Sophie saw the machinery move around him. The Queen's words had reached the surface, but now the family had to discover who had kept them buried beneath procedure. Sophie understood the danger before anyone said it plainly. Edward had been wounded by the discovery, but he had also been given something sacred, and sacred things inside palace walls could be delayed, softened, or buried beneath careful language. The royal archive process, meaning the formal system used to store, classify, and review private royal papers, now became the center of the storm. Historical documents, service papers, legacy decisions, and family memorandums did not simply appear because someone felt ready to reveal them. They moved through custodians, trustees, senior palace offices, and people trained to protect the monarchy from embarrassment. That was why the promise mattered twice. It carried the Queen's authority, but it also exposed the question of whether authority had been ignored. Edward stood near a cabinet of archival boxes, his hand resting on a label tied to Philip's work, and the weight of the responsibility seemed to settle into him all at once. This was no longer about private hurt. It was about guardianship, a role meaning trusted protection over a legacy, a duty, and the records attached to it. He was being asked to guard not just papers, but meaning. Sophie watched him closely, knowing that success had arrived with suffering attached. The confirmation gave him honor, but it also forced him to confront how long that honor had been kept beyond reach. A senior courtier hesitated before handing Sophie a second file, and that small pause told her more than the man intended. She took it calmly, but her expression hardened as she opened the pages. The file revealed that the Queen's promise had been cross-referenced in at least 2 historical indexes, meaning it had appeared in separate archive tracking systems before the family was formally briefed. That detail cut through the room. Someone had known where to find it. Someone had known it existed. And yet Edward had been left to carry on, as though the promise were nothing more than a memory no one could prove. Anne reacted with the force of someone who had lost patience with politeness. She demanded to know why the promise stayed dormant, while public honors moved forward without the full acknowledgement of her mother's original wording. Anne did not speak like a distant observer. She spoke like a daughter who recognized the Queen's hand and understood that silence had become a decision of its own. William listened with growing unease, because the future king could see the larger danger. If the family could bury one promise, what else could be shaped by delay? Edward said little, but his silence had changed. Earlier, it had been grief. Now it carried awareness. Charles knew the same truth was closing in around them. The king could no longer treat the matter as a misunderstanding between memory and paperwork. The confirmed memorandum had become a test of control, honesty, and loyalty to the monarch who had left it behind. Sophie kept her eyes on the second file, sensing there were still gaps no one wanted to explain. And as the hidden structure around the promise gave way, Edward had to face the first painful sign that his life had already changed. Fallout does not always arrive as a public announcement. Sometimes it arrives as a closed door, a canceled briefing, and a man standing in a corridor realizing he is no longer being protected from the truth. Edward had spent years accepting quiet corners. Now the palace was rearranging itself around him, and the very silence that once hid him began to expose everything. Edward felt the first consequence before anyone explained it to him. A legacy briefing that had been planned as routine was suddenly paused, then rewritten, then delayed again. The phrase sounded harmless inside palace language, but it carried force. A legacy briefing meant a formal internal update about how a royal figure's work, records, and public memory would be handled. For years, Philip's Edinburgh papers had been treated as historical material, something to be catalogued, preserved, and referenced with careful respect. Now those same papers had become emotional evidence. They did not simply belong to the past. They pointed toward a promise the Queen had made, and toward the son she had trusted to carry it. Sophie saw how quickly the tone changed around Edward. Staff who once spoke of the Edinburgh records with calm routine now lowered their voices, choosing words as if each one might reveal too much. The trusted confidant watched him leave a tense briefing and stop in the corridor near a closed door. Breathing slowly, his face caught between pain and recognition. She told him he no longer had to minimize what this meant. Edward had spent too long making his own hurt smaller, so the family could remain comfortable. This time, the promise would not shrink to protect anyone else. Charles struggled with the new reality in private. The king wanted to honor Edward, yet he understood the risk pressing against him. If he acknowledged the Queen's promise fully, it could suggest that parts of the family's transition after her death had moved without enough attention to her hidden wishes. That possibility cut deeply, because Charles was not only a brother in this moment, he was the monarch responsible for preserving continuity. And continuity, once questioned, could become a wound. Then the language changed overnight. A planned public reference to Philip's legacy was quietly rewritten, removing broad institutional wording and inserting the phrase personal guardianship. The shift mattered because those words placed Edward at the heart of the duty, not at the edge of it. William saw the importance immediately. The prince quietly instructed aides that the Queen's confirmed promise must not be softened into symbolism. It had to remain clear. It had to remain human. It had to remain hers. Edward absorbed that change with a stillness no one mistook for weakness. His pain had begun to harden into quiet resolve. Sophie could feel it beside him. Charles could sense it from across the widening distance. William understood that the family had entered a different chapter, one where silence no longer protected power as easily as before. But the real turning point would not come from a rewritten line or a paused briefing. It would come when the palace noise finally disappeared, leaving Edward with the only person who knew what this promise had truly cost him. And when the palace noise finally faded, Edward and Sophie faced the promise without witnesses, titles, or protection. The turning point came not from a monarch, a historian, or a palace official, but from Sophie speaking softly in a room where no one else could hear. Edward had been carrying the Queen's promise like a wound. Sophie made him see it differently. It was not proof that he had been forgotten. It was proof that, even in silence, his mother had been keeping him close. Edward stepped away from the formal discussions, with the look of a man who had been honored and injured at the same time. The private sitting room at Windsor gave him space from the aides, the files, the carefully chosen words, and the cold pressure of royal process. A sitting room was meant for quiet family conversation, not official debate, and that mattered, because Edward no longer needed another explanation. He needed someone who knew the man behind the duty. Sophie understood that before he said a word. She had watched the promise move through the palace like a blade wrapped in velvet, bringing recognition with one edge and grief with the other. Edward finally admitted what he had been holding back. Part of him felt grief more than pride. The Queen's words had arrived too late for him to ask why she had written them, too late for him to hear the warmth behind them, too late for him to sit across from his mother and know whether she had understood how much her silence had cost him. That was the cruelty of the moment. The promise gave him honor, but it denied him the conversation every son would have wanted. Sophie listened without correcting his pain, because she knew comfort could not come from pretending the wound was smaller than it was. Sophie then gave him the truth he had been unable to give himself. She told Edward that the Queen chose him because he never turned service into performance. He never pushed himself into the center of the room. He never used duty as a way to demand applause. The trusted confidant reminded him that his mother had watched everything: the patience, the restraint, the quiet work, the loyalty that continued even when recognition did not. Edward tried to hold his composure, but this time he did not fight the tears. He let them come, not as weakness, but as release. Sophie revealed the moment that changed how he understood the promise. She told Edward that after a difficult family gathering years earlier, she had once heard the Queen speak privately of his steadiness, in a documented household account preserved by a senior aide. That detail mattered because it proved the promise was not an isolated note, written after one emotional evening. It was part of a deeper maternal pattern. The monarch had not simply remembered one brave dinner at Balmoral. She had watched her youngest son across years, and quietly decided that his restraint was not absence. It was strength. Edward's grief began to settle into purpose. He told Sophie he would accept the guardianship, but not as a reward, not as a title, and not as a delayed prize. He would accept it as a duty owed to both parents. To Philip, whose work needed protection, and to the Queen, whose promise now needed courage. Sophie looked at him with quiet pride, and for the first time since the historian spoke, Edward seemed less broken by the revelation than shaped by it. By morning, the promise was no longer only a family secret. It had become a story the country could feel. The public reaction began with one front page and spread like a bell through the country. Britain did not see a scandal first. It saw a son, a mother, and a promise held in silence for decades. Outside Windsor Castle, people gathered quietly near the gates, not in anger, but in recognition. The monarchy had offered something rare, a moment where duty looked painfully human. Edward watched the coverage with Sophie beside him, and for the first time, the story no longer belonged only to the private rooms of Windsor. The palace had confirmed that historians authenticated the Queen's decades-old promise, naming him as guardian of Philip's Edinburgh legacy, and the sealed Windsor service papers. Those service papers were protected records tied to Philip's work, private wishes, and long years of public duty. That mattered because the announcement did not frame Edward as a man receiving a prize. It framed him as the person trusted to protect something bigger than himself. And that distinction changed everything. Sophie saw the emotion hit him when the broadcasters chose their words carefully. They did not describe Edward as overlooked. They described him as trusted. That one word seemed to undo years of quiet pain. He had spent so much of his royal life standing beside larger storms, letting duty speak when headlines would not. Now the country was hearing the same truth the Queen had written down in silence. Sophie remained close, steady as always, because she knew public sympathy could comfort him, but it could also expose the wound again. Charles viewed the same coverage alone and said nothing for a long time. The king understood that the response was not hostile. It was not a rebellion against him. It was something more difficult to manage. Deep public feeling. People were not attacking the monarchy, they were grieving with it. They saw Elizabeth and Philip's shared vision of service, restraint, and lifelong duty reflected in a son who had never tried to turn sacrifice into spectacle. Charles knew that kind of reaction could not be ordered, shaped, or controlled. It had to be respected. Then one image captured the entire day. A national newspaper placed Edward on the front page, wiping his eye beneath the headline, "The Promise She Kept." The phrase struck the palace harder than any criticism could have, because it made the story simple and unforgettable. Outside Windsor Castle, a small crowd gathered near the gates, leaving flowers, handwritten notes, and quiet messages thanking Edward for honoring Philip without spectacle. No one needed a grand speech to understand the mood. The country had found its symbol. William recognized the shift immediately. The prince understood that public sympathy had given the family a path forward, but only if they followed the Queen's meaning without watering it down. Sophie knew the same thing. Edward could no longer retreat into the shadows, not after the nation had seen the pain behind his restraint. The promise had moved from archive to family, from family to public memory, and now it demanded action. And when Edward finally stepped into the role the Queen had saved for him, the meaning of the promise became undeniable. In the end, the promise was not about rank, property, or ceremony. It was about recognition. Prince Edward had spent a lifetime proving that loyalty did not need applause to be real, and the Queen's confirmed words gave that truth a permanent place in royal history. What broke him emotionally was not ambition fulfilled. It was the discovery that his mother had seen everything. Edward stepped forward, knowing the moment was larger than any title placed before him. He formally accepted the guardianship of Philip's Edinburgh legacy and the sealed Windsor service papers, not as a reward, but as the duty the Queen had intended for him all along. Guardianship meant trusted protection over a legacy, a record, and the meaning attached to both. The sealed papers were private family and service records connected to Philip's work, protected because they carried personal wishes and sensitive decisions. Edward understood why this mattered. These were not lifeless documents. They were the final bridge between a father's mission, a mother's promise, and a son's quiet endurance. Charles placed the confirmed memorandum before Edward in a private family moment, and the king's voice carried the strain of everything the family had survived. He told his brother that their mother's promise would be honored without dilution. The memorandum, a written record of the monarch's private instruction, had become impossible to soften or hide. Charles knew this decision mattered, because it protected continuity after years of uncertainty, and because it showed the family could still obey the Queen's deeper wishes, even after her voice was gone. Edward listened without triumph. He had not won a battle. He had survived one. Edward looked toward Sophie before signing the acceptance record, and she nodded with quiet pride. The trusted confidant had watched him carry the burden from shock to grief, from grief to purpose, and now from purpose to public meaning. The acceptance record, the formal written confirmation of his role, turned a hidden promise into a recognized duty. Sophie understood the cost behind that signature. Edward had been seen at last, but the recognition had arrived through loss. That contrast gave the moment its power: success wrapped in sorrow, honor born from absence. Anne then confirmed, through a documented family account, that the Queen's promise had never been a sentimental note. She said the monarch had made a deliberate judgment about character, patience, and trust. Anne's words mattered because she recognized her mother's tone and refused to let the promise be treated as emotional decoration. William saw the lesson clearly. The prince understood that the crown survives not only through power, ceremony, and inheritance, but through those who serve without demanding attention. Edward had become proof of that truth. The promise completed Edward's long emotional journey, restored Philip's legacy to the person the Queen trusted most, and reminded the monarchy that quiet loyalty can outlast every louder claim. The story ends with Edward no longer standing at the edge of history, but exactly where the Queen had promised he belonged. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.